one of the things that I've been contemplating more recently is language, and the assumptions that we make about language, that it's just this tool that we use for describing things. You look at something, you describe it, you give it a name. And that often feels like the end of the story. It's just something that we use to communicate. But I'm no longer sure that that's actually the case. I watched the video by Chase Hughes recently, and it made me start to notice something. Not about language itself, but about how the language itself shapes the way that we reason about things, whether it's science, whether it's cosmology. Now, just for a little bit of context, Chase Hughes, if you've never heard of him, he's a behavioral science expert, #1 best-selling author. He's known for his behavioral profiling. He runs his own YouTube channel, which I'll link down below in the description. So in this video, he makes the rather extraordinary claim that language hijacks reality, and that this means that language is a parasite. Now, while I don't necessarily fully agree with his claim, something about it resonated much more with what I've been looking at more recently in cosmology and assumptions and circular reasoning. And I think actually it's quite profound. But let's start with a simple demonstration so that we're all on the same page. You understand the basic concept of what he's trying to describe. So let's try something small. Look at anything that's near you, an object, a thing. Don't choose it, just glance at it. Now, for 1 second, try not to name it. Don't reach for the word, don't classify it, don't even describe it. Just look. And then now look at something else. And if you've tried, you've probably felt it. How quickly the word forces its way in. How desperate the mind is to categorize it, to give it a label. It's almost as if the name leaps ahead of our experience. As if the description arrives way before the thing it's supposed to be describing. Now, I guess we rarely question this. We just accept it. But the moment you see it, that this reflex exists, an unsettling realization follows. How much of reality is in a sense shaped by the words that came before it? And if that happens in something as mundane and simple as, a book or whatever it is that you were looking at, then how does it shape our understanding of science, cosmology, of the universe itself? Now, Chase argues that once you named it, you actually stop seeing it. We instead see the label. The language is stepping in front of our reality, telling us what the world contains before we've actually seen it. But that raises a question. Who gave it that label in the first place? You didn't actually choose it. You inherited it. So in a sense, we build entire worlds from concepts that we inherit long before we've had a choice. And I would also argue that the opposite is also true. That unless we know the object, that it won't register properly until we've actually named it, we've given it a label, or we've categorized it. Now, while I feel the word parasite is probably too strong a word, for me anyway, I do think it's worth exploring the implications of what Chase is discussing and how that then connects to science and cosmology. So for me, the first interesting part is essentially that language is acting like a filter, and one that we rarely notice, one that's almost automatic, natural. It just is. It's a learnt habit. We react to a label, not to the object. We feel the category, not the emotion itself. So we don't just feel sadness, we feel what we've learnt sadness is supposed to mean, all the different labels that come with it, the story, the expectations, the behaviours that are attached to that word when it arrives in our mind. And we engage with the model of the person, not the person that's right in front of us. So we've already labelled them as a particular type of person, and that's how we interact with them. Now, this might seem quite black and white, and I appreciate that there is probably very much a nuance here. But most of the time when we talk to someone and we discuss things, it's from the perspective of the label that we've given them. And it almost preempts what we expect to happen. And for me, this is quite an important realization. It's not just a psychological quirk. What language is doing to experience, models do to the universe. And the second thing that I think is also worth contemplating in what Hugh discussed was what it actually means for identity, how labels quietly shape the selves that we grow into. Now, we get labelled long before we ever got a chance to really understand who we are, whether it's that we're too quiet, noisy, difficult, lazy, and so on. That those labels were not discoveries that we made ourselves. They're descriptions that are handed to us. And possibly by people who've only ever experienced a very small slice, and they're reacting to only that part of it. But once the label arrives, it becomes the lens. We grow towards it. So often we see this in science, and I would argue in particular in cosmology. The framework that they use becomes the lens that is used to decide which observations matter and which ones don't. We filter reality to match the model. And just like identity, the labels come early, whether it's expansion, dark matter, dark energy, wavefunction, collapse, vacuum energy. These are terms that we treat as real, but it's not like we stumbled into a lump of dark matter and suddenly decided to give it a label. They were invented to help make sense of data that we didn't understand, that they're tools to help confusing data make sense. But the moment that the label exists, we start to see the world through it. We organize observations around it. We teach students to expect it. And before long, the tool that we use to make sense of the data now becomes the reality we accept. It slowly stops being a hypothesis and becomes a worldview. What began as description turns into a decision about what the universe is allowed to contain. And I think this is where the pattern from earlier reappears in probably its most powerful form. Just as we mistake the identity labels for our true selves, we also begin to mistake the scientific categories for the structure of the universe. And I guess because of the way that language works, it's not that we can simply abandon this model and choose a new one. We live inside of them, and it's a lot harder to question something from the inside than from the outside. And it's not that the data doesn't matter, it's the language which decides how the data is allowed to speak. And I think that's why Chase's video struck me so much, because it's not about the metaphor, but really that it's mirroring something that I keep encountering in physics and cosmology. Now, some might argue, oh, yeah, okay, fine. In the end, if we describe something with an equation, then maths gives us credence above language. It allows us to break free from the limitations of simple language and describe things in a purer way. Maths can't lie or hide the truth. That's often what's said. But I think the reality is that maths is just a language. It's a very precise one, but it's a language nonetheless. And like any language, it has its own categories and its own blind spot. And because we're told it sits above language, that blind spot becomes much easier to miss. And once you see how language shapes experience and how mathematical models shape what science believes the universe contains, you begin to notice something deeper. That the categories that we inherit don't just organize reality, they defend it. A label in science creates a framework that interprets the evidence through the labels. So, expansion becomes redshift, which becomes age and distance. Inflation becomes the initial conditions that predict the patterns we use to argue for inflation. And I would argue that this is not a deliberate choice, but rather it's the natural behavior of a system once the description becomes more stable than the underlying reality. Categories are there to simplify the world. So when something doesn't fit that particular category, well, it's not the category's fault. So we adjust the world. Maybe a more concrete example. If the data doesn't fit, we call it noise. If the observations don't fit, well, we call it an anomaly. And this is how we create the models that turn into self-reinforcing loops. We build a model to explain the universe, and then we expect the universe to behave in a way that essentially keeps the model intact. And when it doesn't, then we have to invent new things that the universe must have in order for it to match what the theory tells us should happen. All the while not questioning whether that starting assumption was ever correct. Because in reality, that starting assumption is probably buried layers deep under different assumptions that no one wants to question. So what began as a description slowly turns into the boundary of what is considered possible. The map essentially becomes the territory. The metaphor becomes the mechanism. And that label, well, that now becomes a law. That's the scientific version of the identity trap. Somehow, we've misunderstood our relationship to the categories and labels that we use to describe it. But when you let all of this sit and slowly cogitate for a while, you realize something rather uncomfortable. The cost of living inside the descriptions, it isn't just intellectual, it's personal. I guess, in some sense, it's the big difference between living life and experiencing life. And that probably sounds a little bit too hippie, but essentially, language allows us a way to process the world that we live in, to create the slideshows of the categories that we have, moments that you've already seen, because you named it the moment that it appeared. So a tree becomes tree, and the sky becomes the label sky. The face that you look at becomes whatever story that you already carry about it. Too often in life, we sit with these labels so comfortably that experience rarely reaches us, not in its raw form. But it can do sometimes. Sometimes we can experience without labels, without language, just raw experience. The birth of a child, the loss of someone you love, a moment of fear or awe. At those moments, you're essentially lost for words. The experience overwhelms you. Pure, raw, uncompressed. The language, that part lags far behind. And that realization makes you see that essentially we navigate the world not through what's directly in front of us, but rather through the framework that we inherit. And the same is true in science. It's not through the data, but through the model that we've learned to trust. And once you realize this, you can't unsee it. It's It's not about silence and not about throwing away frameworks that we rely on, but it's about remembering the order that things are meant to arrive in. And when that order is reversed, the entire worldview can stagnate. And I think that's really what this reflection is about. A reminder to myself, as much as anyone, that the world is much larger than the words that we use to shrink it.